When we think of royal burials, we picture grand tombs topped by imposing effigies, but not all members of the monarchy were laid to rest with such splendour. Scattered amongst crypts with other people's names on them, and in some of the most famous churches in the United Kingdom, are the marked and unmarked graves of scores of little princes and princesses, all buried long before they could wear a crown. Some had no names, most have no memorials, but they deserve to be remembered too. So in this episode of History Calling, we ask, where were royal babies buried by the Tudors and the Stuarts? What were their stories, and what was found when the vaults were opened up by the Victorians and some of the little coffins were seen for the first time in centuries? Until the 20th century, it was a sad reality for most royal families in England, Scotland, and later the United Kingdom that some of their children would die excruciatingly young, perhaps living only a few minutes, hours, days, or weeks, or even being stillborn. When they didn't survive, that then left the issue of what to do with their earthly remains. The following is a discussion of many, but possibly not all, the burials of royal infants from the Tudor and Stuart dynasties. I've chosen to focus only on these families and only on the children of monarchs or people who later became monarchs in order to make this video more manageable, but you still shouldn't consider it an exhaustive list. Tragically, there were simply too many dead children for me to cover them all, and you'll even hear about the odd one who is only known about because their coffin was found centuries later. They left behind no trace in the surviving written record. In some cases, we know infants existed, but have no idea where they were buried. I'll mention them too, and we'll also discuss those little princes and princesses who lived up to the age of 4. We start with the Tudors. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York had 3 known children who died in infancy. They were Princess Elizabeth, lived from 1492 to 1495, Prince Edmund, lived from 1499 to 1500, and Princess Catherine, who was born and died in 1503, with her mother also dying as a result of that childbirth. Of course, the King and Queen also famously had another son, Prince Arthur, who died young, being only 15 years old, but as he wasn't an infant, we won't be discussing him any further here, though I will leave my episode all about his death and burial linked for you. Little Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey and given a tomb which now stands in the chapel of Edward the Confessor, near the grave of Henry III. It is made of black marble inlaid with brass, and there was originally a gilt copper effigy on it which had been stolen no later than 1677, as noted by author Francis Sandford. This meant that the inscriptions which were on it are gone too. However, fortunately, they had already been copied out for posterity, and so I can tell you that the one written around the verge of the effigy said, Elizabeth, second child, which is incorrect as she was the 4th, of Henry VII, King of England, France and Ireland, and of the most serene lady Queen Elizabeth his consort, who was born on the 2nd day of the month of July in the year of our Lord 1492, and died on the 14th day of the month of September in the year of our Lord 1495. Upon whose soul may God have mercy. Amen. There was also a plate at the bottom of the effigy which read, Hereafter death has a royal offspring in this tomb, viz. The young and noble Elizabeth, daughter of that illustrious prince Henry VII, who swayed the sceptre of 2 kingdoms. Atropos, the most severe messenger of death, snatched her away, but may she have eternal life in heaven. Now, Elizabeth is actually quite unusual in having been given such a grave, and I think we can put that down to the fact that she lived to the age of 3 and had time to make a real impression on her parents. Her brother Edmund and sister Catherine were both buried in the Abbey too, according to its website, which specifically says that Edmund is in the Edward the Confessor chapel as well, but neither has a memorial, which, as you'll see as we go along, is actually much more normal. It is interesting as well that little Catherine was not buried with her mother, who ended up in the grand tomb in the Henry VII chapel once it was complete, despite the fact that they died at essentially the same time. Of course, it is always possible that the child was placed with her mother originally and that they were later split up, as Elizabeth of York has been moved from her initial resting place and her final tomb has been opened several times to put others into it or remove them from it. See my episodes about the burials of her granddaughter Elizabeth I and great-great-grandson James I to learn more. Moving on to Henry VIII and his numerous lost children. From this infamous king's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon came only one surviving child, the future Mary I, and at least 5 losses that we know of. There was a girl on the 31st of January 1510 who may have been at as little as 3 or 4 months gestation and certainly no more than 33 weeks, as her parents only married 33 weeks earlier. A boy, Prince Henry, who lived about 7 weeks in early 1511. A short-lived boy in September 1513. A boy of about 8 months gestation in November 1514 who may have been stillborn, and a stillborn girl of about 8 months gestation on the 10th of November 1518. Of course, we only know for sure what happened to Prince Henry, about whom I have a whole video. He was buried with great pomp in Westminster Abbey, but there was no monument, and we don't know exactly where he is. In other cases, the infants may have been disposed of. I'm sorry, I don't know how else to put it, as they would not have been allowed to be buried in consecrated ground if they hadn't been baptised. It's always possible that they were quietly put somewhere in the abbey or a more low-key church, but we're unlikely to ever know for sure. By his second wife, Anne Boleyn, Henry had Elizabeth I, followed by 2 miscarriages, one of which, in the summer of 1534, was at quite an advanced stage, the other in January 1536 being a boy only about 15 weeks along. I am unaware of any records of a funeral, and in the absence of further evidence, we must assume that these children were not given a Christian burial in a church. If you're interested in why Henry and his wives had such problems producing healthy offspring, by the way, I'll leave my episode about their fertility problems linked for you. And so we move on to the Stuarts. James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, and prior to this, he and his wife, Anne of Denmark, had already lost 2 of their children, 1-year-old Margaret in 1600 and 4-month-old Robert in 1602. Margaret was most likely buried in Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh, though we don't know for sure, nor can we be sure where Robert lies, but again, Holyrood, which has its own royal vault, seems a distinct possibility. Neither has a monument. Once James and Anne were in England, they would lose 2 more young children. Sophia in 1606, aged 2 days, and Mary in 1607, aged 2 years. Little Mary was heard to murmur, I go, as she lay dying, and in their cases we do have monuments to them, which is interesting as James did not erect one to their 18-year-old brother, Prince Henry, when he died in 1612 and was buried in the vault of his grandmother, Mary Queen of Scots. The girls are interred in the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey, in a vault at the bottom of that in which Elizabeth I and Mary I lie. They are also in front of the urn in which the supposed bones of the princes in the tower are interred, though those wouldn't have been there at the time the girls were buried. Sophia's monument is a crib with an effigy of her inside it that can really only be seen, by tourists at least, by looking in a mirror hung opposite it. The inscription on it, when translated from Latin, reads, Sophia, a royal rosebud, plucked by premature fate, and snatched away from her parents, James, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, and Queen Anne, that she might flourish again in the rose garden of Christ, was placed here on the 23rd of June in the 4th year of the reign of King James, 1606. Isn't it interesting, by the way, that only James's English reign is being counted here, not his Scottish reign? As for Mary, she is shown lying on her side on a cushion, wearing a Medici-style collar and with her feet on a lion. Her epitaph reads, Mary, daughter of James, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, and of Queen Anne, received into heaven in earliest infancy. I found joy for myself and left grief to my parents. 16th of December, 1607. She actually died in September, however. Those who wish joy ask sympathy. She lived 2 years, 5 months, 8 days. Before we get to the next generation of Stuarts, Please remember to give the video a like and subscribe to my channel with the notification bell switched on so you never miss an upload. You can also join my YouTube membership for extra perks, or find me over on Patreon where I release even more bonuses, including early access to ad-free videos and extra podcasts. The link is below for you, as is a link to my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can get 2 complimentary downloads by signing up to my free mailing list. For those of you with Irish ancestry, you might also want to check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors online. Details are also below. Charles I and his wife, Henrietta Maria of France, would have 3 children who died very young. They were Prince Charles, born and died on the 13th of May, 1629, not to be confused with his brother born the following May, who became Charles II. Princess Catherine, who was born and died on the 29th of January 1639, although some sources say June. Then Princess Anne, who died at the age of 3 in November 1640. Little Charles was buried in the south side of the Henry VII chapel the day after his birth and death, with some sources saying he lived long enough to be baptised and others not. This information comes from a burial register starting with deaths in 1607, which was compiled by Joseph Lester, published in 1876, and based on older documents, which were themselves apparently based on even older records. It also states that Catherine was buried somewhere in the Abbey too, though it notes that no record of it occurs in the register, which is especially defective about that period. As for Anne, she was interred in the same building, but Lester says that, despite what the older manuscripts claim, namely that she died and was buried on the same day, quote, "It may be doubted if she was buried the same day, and it is probable that the transcriber of the old register, not finding the record among the fragments or the date illegible, entered the burial under the known date of her death." There is also a tragic tale about this little princess's final hours. Apparently too weak to make her way through the Lord's Prayer, she repeated the shorter prayer, "Lighten mine eyes, O Lord, lest I sleep the sleep of death," before she quietly slipped away. Moving on another generation. Charles II had no legitimate children, and though his wife, Catherine of Braganza, had miscarriages, these were quite early, and I am unaware of any evidence for burials for these infants. His brother, James Duke of York, later James II of England and James VII of Scotland, was another matter. With his first wife, Lady Anne Hyde, he had 2 surviving daughters, the future Mary II and Queen Anne. But the couple also lost 6 infants named Charles Duke of Cambridge, died May 1661, aged 4.5 months, Charles Duke of Kendal, died May 1667, aged 10.5 months, James Duke of Cambridge, died the 20th of June 1667 when he was a little shy of 4 years old, Henrietta, died November 1669, aged 10 months, Edgar Duke of Cambridge, died June 1671, aged 3, and Catherine died December 1671, aged 10 months. The girls, by the way, were known as the Lady Henrietta and the Lady Catherine during their lifetimes. They would have been princesses if they were alive today, but the rules around titles were a little different then. If you're wondering why their sisters, Mary and Anne, are often referred to as princesses, it's because they gained those titles upon their marriages to Prince William of Orange and Prince George of Denmark. By his second wife, Mary of Modena, James would eventually have a surviving son and daughter, but not before they lost at least 9 other children. 5 were miscarriages or stillbirths, these words get used interchangeably in this period, in 1674, 1675, 1681, 1683 and 1684. The other 4 were Catherine Laura, died in 1675, aged less than 9 months, shock of which caused Mary of Modena to miscarry the child she was then pregnant with. Charles, Duke of Cambridge, yes, another one, who died in 1677, aged 1 month. Isabella died 1681, aged 4, and Charlotte Maria died 1682, aged 2 months. There are also what I'm calling some phantom royal children listed on the internet and attributed to James and Mary. One is supposedly buried in Holyrood Abbey, and there is a child, possibly the same one, I don't know, called Elizabeth, also attributed to them, who supposedly lived and died in circa 1678. Both claims are made on Wikipedia, neither lists a source, and I'm unaware of other sources which support the existence of this child or children, and I therefore won't be mentioning them any further. If you've lost track, I don't blame you, but we've gone through a staggering total of 15 confirmed children who didn't live past infancy, with only 4 who did, and we haven't even gotten to James's illegitimate offspring yet, though we will be talking about one of them shortly. As with the other miscarriages and stillbirths mentioned, I doubt there was a formal burial for such losses, but as was the usual modus operandi by now, the rest of the children were buried in Westminster Abbey. The first little Duke of Cambridge was recorded as being put in a vault on the south side of King Henry VII's chapel. The Duke of Kendal was, quote, laid in the vault with the rest of the princes of the royal blood, with his brother James put in there with him the following month. The Lady Henrietta was added to the royal vault, as was her mother, the Duchess of York, who died in 1671. We have additional records showing that the Duchess's children, Edgar and Catherine, joined her there by the end of the year. Moving on to Mary of Modena children. Catherine Laura, Charles Duke of Cambridge, Isabella and Charlotte Maria were all put in the Abbey, though they have no individual memorials. So out of 15 lost pregnancies or infant deaths, we have burial records for 10 of them. It's only the stillbirths or miscarriages that we lack such records for. Let's turn now to James's surviving daughters by Lady Anne Hyde. Mary II had a few miscarriages in the Principality of Orange, of which she was princess by marriage, which we aren't going to look at as they occurred outside of the British Isles. And that takes us to her sister Anne, who is perhaps most famous for having had 17 known pregnancies by her husband, Prince George of Denmark, but no surviving children at the time of her own death in 1714. I already have an episode looking at her tragic record, which I'll link for you, but in short, between 1684 and 1700, she had 6 miscarriages, 6 stillbirths, and 5 children who were born alive. These 5 were Mary, born in 1685, and Anne Sophia, born in 1686, who died within days of each other in February 1687, having both contracted smallpox. Then there was William, Duke of Gloucester, born in 1689 and died in 1700. Another Mary, they really did like to recycle names in this era, who lived only 2 hours on the 14th of October 1690, and George, who apparently lived until an hour after his baptism on the day of his birth, 17th of April 1692. If you're wondering about causes of death for these children, by the way, and others mentioned in this video, we often don't know, but some of them died quickly because they had been born prematurely, as seems to be the case with Anne's final 2 live births. Now, interestingly for Anne, we do know that some of her stillborns were buried in the Abbey, for Chester's Register notes the burial of a stillborn child of Prince George's buried in the vault on the 13th of May 1684, though Chester notes that this burial entry was in the unofficial register only, whatever that means. This is the earliest record I've come across for the child of a monarch or future monarch having such a burial, despite not being born alive, though of course the fact that I haven't seen such a record for another doesn't mean there aren't any. And to me, it indicates a softening of attitudes towards unchristened children by allowing them to be buried in consecrated ground, though I imagine if one wasn't royal, the rules were slower to change. The couple's 2 little girls were laid to rest in the Abbey in 1687 too, but there is no record for the stillborn child their mother had lost the month before, though the boy she lost later that year, also stillborn, is listed as being buried there that October. Their second daughter, named Mary, joined her brothers and sisters at Westminster in 1690, as did little George in April 1692 and a stillborn girl in March 1693. None of Anne's other babies appear to have been placed there, but we find one of them buried in 1698 with Anne's grandfather Charles I, plus Henry VIII and his 3rd wife Jane Seymour, in a vault in St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. People have been known to get confused when they hear this, thinking that the child of Queen Anne buried with Henry must be one of his lost children by Anne Boleyn, but it's not. It's definitely one of Anne Stuart's children. Aside from this child and the couple buried in Scotland, the rest of those we've looked at were interred in Westminster Abbey. But where exactly? Because between the offspring of Charles I, James II, and Queen Anne, there were dozens of them. The answer for most, if not all of them, is, drumroll, they were put into the vault of none other than their scandalous ancestor, Mary, Queen of Scots, which is on the south side of the Henry VII chapel, just as we heard it described in the burial register. But how do I know this, given that there are no individual memorials to any of these children, and the register doesn't specifically say that they were put in with Mary? Well, we have several sources which reveal this information. In 1711, a man named Jodocus Krull published a book about the burials in Westminster Abbey, in which he specifically said that in this vault, apart from a number of adults and older children resting there were also the leaden coffins of James II's 10 children by Anne Hyde and Mary of Modena, all named and the Latin inscriptions on their coffins given. With them are Queen Anne's children, specifically little Anne Sophia, both the Marys, George, and the 11-year-old William, Duke of Gloucester, plus, quote, 2 or 3 children that were stillborn, which gives a total of 8 and tallies exactly with the register for the Abbey. There are also memorial plaques in that part of the chapel which list a lot of the names of those buried in the Scottish Queen's vault. We have one in the floor, for instance, which, aside from the adults, specifically names Charles an infant, 1629, Anne an infant, 1637, stating in brackets that they were both Charles I's children. It also mentions 10 of James II's infant children, meaning the ones who lived long enough to get names, and although it doesn't clarify which mother they were by, this number matches the total he lost by his wives, whom we know were registered as being buried in the Abbey and were mentioned by Krull. It does not include the 5 miscarriages or stillbirths. Also listed is Queen Anne's son, William, Duke of Gloucester, and, quote, 17 other of her infant children. Now, the tally for Queen Anne's children doesn't match what Krull and the burial register said, as they only list 8 of her offspring being in this vault, including Gloucester. Also, if Queen Anne had 17 pregnancies and this plaque says there are 18 children in here, then how can there be one in St. George's Chapel at Windsor? There are several potential explanations. One is that Anne had twins on at least 1, maybe 2 occasions, so she potentially had as many as 19 offspring. That would seem to clear the problem up right away, but my issue with that idea is that some of her pregnancies were lost quite early on. A quick look at the dates on which she lost them shows that some of them are only a few months apart, and we have primary sources which specifically say that some of her children were only at 2 or 3 months gestation, too early for their gender to even be ascertained. To be blunt, there just wouldn't have been an awful lot to bury in some instances, and I find it unlikely that 10 children were put in here without being recorded in the burial registers, especially when other known stillborns did get a mention. I wonder if this plaque was created by someone who got a little over-enthusiastic and just rounded up, using known information about Anne's pregnancy record, and if the extra children are other lost royal babies now forgotten by history. There is also another plaque on the wall, quite faded to the point that some of the information on it is now gone. It dates to no earlier than 1869 for reasons which will become apparent in a minute, so it's hardly a primary source. However, just for the record, it specifically lists some of the children in the vault as being all 10 of James II's infant legitimate sons and daughters, plus 8 of Queen Anne's. It's interesting that its tally for Anne doesn't match the floor plaque just a few feet away. The reason I know it dates to 1869 or later is that in that year, during a search for the missing remains of James I, who eventually showed up elsewhere, the tomb was opened under the supervision of the then Dean of the Abbey, Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, and one of those little coffins found was for a child entirely forgotten by history until then, but who is listed on the wall plaque. He was James Darnley, illegitimate son of James II. His surname was a nod to Lord Darnley, father of James I. This boy died on the 22nd of April 1685, aged about 8 months, and it was supposed by Stanley that his mother was James's known mistress, Catherine Sedley, because her other child by James was also given the Darnley surname. Stanley wrote a 2-volume work on the memorials in the Abbey, plus a supplement to them, and in that supplement he left an invaluable first-hand account of what was found when the Stuart vault was peered into, saying that when he and his associates descended the steps beneath the Queen of Scots memorial, there appeared a large vault of brick, 12.5 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 6 feet high. A startling, it may almost be said, an awful scene presented itself. A vast pile of leaden coffins rose from the floor, some of full stature, the larger number varying in form from that of the full-grown child to the merest infant, confusingly heaped upon the others, whilst several urns of various shapes were tossed about in irregular positions throughout the vault. The urns would have held the organs of those bodies which had been embalmed. He described the coffins of the adults in the tomb, then said that spread out over the top of some of them, quote, lay the small coffins, often hardly more than cases, of the numerous progeny of that unhappy family, doomed, as this gloomy chamber impressed on all who saw it, with a more than ordinary doom, infant after infant fading away, which might else have preserved the race. First, the 10 children of James II, including one whose existence was unknown before, James Darnley, natural son. For the record, I think there were actually the 10 legitimate named children plus James Darnley. And then 18 children of Queen Anne, of whom one alone required the receptacle of a full-grown child, William, Duke of Gloucester. It was a miserable sight, and Stanley concluded by saying that it was impossible to view this wreck and ruin of the Stuart dynasty without a wish, if possible, to restore something like order and decency amongst the relics of so much departed greatness. The confusion which, at first sight, gave the impression of wanton havoc and neglect had been doubtless produced chiefly by the pressure of superincumbent weight, which could not have been anticipated by those who made the arrangement, when the remains of the younger generations were accumulated beyond all expectation on the remains of their progenitors, so the weight of the children's coffins was damaging the coffins of the adults. In the absence of directions from any superior authority, a scruple was felt against any endeavour to remove these little waifs and strays of royalty from the solemn resting place where they had been gathered round their famous and unfortunate ancestress. But as far as could be, they were cleared from the larger coffins and placed in the small open space at the foot of the steps. To the best of my knowledge, this is the last time that vault was opened, and so I think we may take Stanley's account of its contents as the most up-to-date and authoritative we have, but it's far from perfect. As you've no doubt noticed by now, between the burial register, Crull's book, the plaques in the chapel, and Stanley's book, the accounts of which children are in this vault are quite confused, particularly with regards to which of James II and Queen Anne's kids are in there. If the 10 named infants of James II include the illegitimate baby Darnley, for instance, then one of James's legitimate children is missing, but Crull specifically lists them all, as does the wall plaque, though it also adds in little James Darnley. For his part, Stanley includes little Darnley in his list of 10 children in the supplement to his work on the memorials in the Abbey, but in the main book he said that there were 10 legitimate children of James II plus baby Darnley, making 11 total. He also says elsewhere that 2, not 3, of Charles I's infant children were in here, but could not be identified, which just adds further confusion as to which coffins belong to whom. Part of the problem was no doubt that some of the coffin plaques were missing, and Stanley surmised that they had either perished or, as is not improbable, been detached by the workmen at the previous reopening of the vault at each successive interment. Out of this mess of conflicting sources, I'm going to tell you what I think happened, and bear in mind this is just the best I can do with the information available and may not be quite right as there's an unavoidable dose of supposition in here. I think that the coffins of the children in the Stuart vault are most likely those of the 3 infants of Charles I and Henrietta Maria, all 10 of James II's legitimate children who lived long enough to get a name, plus baby Darnley, 8 children of Queen Anne, including William, Duke of Gloucester, and possibly, just possibly, a couple of others of hers if the pregnancies were far enough along to warrant a burial. As for any outstanding little coffins, I think it's possible that they contain unknown illegitimate children, or even grandchildren, of Charles II and or James II. After all, if James Darnley could be put in here with no record of his burial, why shouldn't that have happened to other little royal byblowes? In support of that argument, I would point out that we know that several of Charles's adult children and infant grandchildren are buried elsewhere in the Henry VII chapel, so why shouldn't some others be in this vault? And if you're wondering where Charles II got children from when I said he had none with his wife, the answer is that he had an obscene number with his many, many mistresses. I do wish that Stanley had provided a count of exactly how many coffins there were and had a picture drawn of the inside of the tomb, as was done with the Henry VII vault, which was also opened at around this time. But he didn't, so we just have to figure out who's in there as best we can with the information we've got. Phew, that was a lot to keep track of. Well done if you've made it to the end and were able to keep up with all of that. Even I found it a real challenge. Let me know in the comments who you think the extra babies in the Stuart vault are. More of Queen Anne's children or other royal offspring. If you find this interesting, you should check out my episodes on Prince Henry Tudor, the lost heir of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and on Queen Catherine Parr's missing daughter Mary Seymour, who disappeared from the historical record as a toddler. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.